with discretion, we do occasionally have people back 2 years in a row, and our next speaker, Scott Taylor, is another one of those speakers for the reason that shortly after he spoke to us last June, he went back to Iraq. He was then kidnapped in northern Iraq. He spent a harrowing week, I think it was, 5 days in captivity. He was soundly beaten and lived under the perpetual threat of being beheaded. I thought that earned him a ticket back to this stage. Scott, come up here. Thanks. And tell us about your experience and why on earth you went back.
Okay, when I say it's good to be back, I mean it. When we were invited back, we were really excited about this coming back. Myself and my wife, it was actually 2 years ago I was here. I don't mean to correct you, Moses, but time does fly. And when we came here, we had no idea what to expect the first time, and we really, really enjoyed it. So when we got this opportunity to come back, we were really excited. When I came here 2 years ago in June, I had just come back at that point, June 2003. Go back in time, that was like 1 month after President George Bush had declared mission accomplished. I'd gone back in, came back, and on this stage said, mission not accomplished. This is going to be a bloody insurgency. They're not going to give up until the last American's gone, and after that, it will probably degenerate into a bloody civil war. Well, I'm not going to stand up here for 20 minutes and say, I told you so. But I could say, I told you so. So we're going to avoid that. And as Moses mentioned in the speech, a momentous event happened last year, which seemed to define my life from that point forward. It used to be when I went on television, regardless of whatever the subject was, they would put my name underneath. It could be editor of Esprit de Corps magazine, author of fill-in book title, military analyst, Balkan expert, Iraq correspondent, etc. Now, whenever I go on TV, it says underneath my name, former hostage, which is probably pretty unnerving to people that are watching when I'm talking about Canadian submarines or who the new Chief of Defense Staff is. But for some reason, whatever accolades or credentials you've gained before that, this one trumps everything, former hostage. I've given a lot of presentations, of course, since the event, a lot of media interest internationally on how getting the story became the story, which, as a journalist, is actually very frustrating for one, and B, it's a little bit embarrassing. Nobody sets out to get captured, certainly not in the manner that I was. But having survived that, I felt that I had gleaned a sort of viewpoint that few others had survived to tell about. And in particular, I found that the American media didn't really want to know about it, which I found rather unnerving. We go down there and we talk about how it had happened, how myself and a Turkish journalist had gone to this remote Turkoman enclave. It's a city of Turkish-speaking indigenous Iraqis in northwestern Iraq that no other Westerner has been to in about 20 years. I had been there the previous June. The Americans were about to launch an attack. We felt we could go in and report on the collateral damage, etc., which I've done in Fallujah and Najaf, etc., so it wasn't that far-fetched. But when we got to the outskirts of town, it was the American-paid Iraqi police that actually turned us over to some masked gunmen who turned out to be a Turkmen chapter of the Ansar al-Islam, which is linked to Al-Qaeda. Now, during the course of our captivity, we were moved about several times from Tel Afar into the city of Mosul, which I'm sure many of you, if you watch the news, have heard that name as well. There again, we saw firsthand that at many of the checkpoints where we were transited through, not only were the police aware that these were Mujahideen holy fighters in the convoy, but that we were hostages, and they were offering them cigarettes, water, encouragement, cheering them on. So basically there was open collusion between the police and the insurgency at that time, if they weren't supervised by the Americans. Another interesting thing for us was that the Turkomans, who we thought there was a divide between them and the Arab groups in the north, were openly cooperating with them. These Ansar al-Islam types were fundamentalists. They turned us over to Arab fundamentalists who called themselves the pupils, which is sort of like the students or the Taliban. But they also negotiated at one point with former Baathists who were secular. So I'm thinking, okay, by the time we get released, I'm telling the American TV producer all this. This was showing us that there was, the existing bridges between the ethnicity and the different religious factions between Sunni, Shia, fundamentalist, secular, were all blurred when it came to the insurgency. They all seemed to have one common purpose, and that was to oust the Americans, and they were working together towards that. So the TV producer is looking at me with this blank look, and he says, okay, but that's all wonderful, but when you go on TV You can't use any of those terms. I said, what? He said, you can't use Al-Qaeda, Ansar al-Islam, Turkmen, Arab, Kurd, Ba'athist. He says, you have to pick one, Iraqi or insurgent, and stick to it. Because our audience, they're aiming, this was a serious news program, is aimed at the attention span of a 10-year-old. So I'm thinking, well, so what? Your country's at war. They need to know who it is that they're fighting. Nevertheless, when I went on TV, I used the word insurgent repeatedly. So the insurgents captured us, took us through the insurgents, who transferred us to the insurgents, who negotiated with the insurgents, who released us, which didn't really provide for a gripping story. They probably thought this guy's an idiot. Even the 10-year-olds were turning me off. What they did pick up on, though, U.S. media loved the fact that for some reason I was always being accused of being an American pig, Jewish pig, or a Mossad spy. And they really picked up on that. Particularly Geraldo Rivera, of all people. He was very empathetic during the interview. He actually offered to come up to Ottawa, wrap his arms around me, and give me a big hug, which was really rather disturbing. It wasn't comforting at all. So, in answer to his question, I mean, why was it they kept accusing me of being a Jewish individual? These people, this is not the place in the world where they're really worldly. They've never been outside their village. I mean, they don't know Canada exists. They've never seen a Westerner, as I said, for 20 years. They only get what they're told by their clerics as to who the kafir or infidels would be. And of course, the Mossad, the Jewish, the boogeyman plays big in their mindset. And of course, the fact that as we got passed off from group to group, we've been separated, long separated from our passports and identification, which had been destroyed. So you've got no way of identifying who you are. I went through multiple strip searches. I've got an eagle tattooed on my arm, and we won't give you any other details, but there's other reasons why they suspected I was Jewish. Thank God for Google searches. They got me out alive. The other thing that Americans loved to talk about was the actual torture itself. They really fixated on that. They didn't care who they're fighting and why they're fighting the American people. It was the specifics as to what did they do to you, which I can remember one interview in particular explaining to her how this was in sort of clinical terms, this is the bastonada torture that they used, which is where they tie your hands behind your back, you're laid on your back blindfolded, and they put your feet in the air, tied to a pole, and then they beat the bottoms of your feet and your legs. The legs are with broom handle-sized poles, and then they use sort of a reed-like whip on the bottoms of your feet. And I was telling her how this is supposed to be very systematic. They'll hit the same spot until you convulse with a Charlie horse sort of thing. And the guy that was doing the interrogating at the same time that they were torturing me, he sort of lost it because I wasn't giving him the answer he wanted. So at one point, he actually reached down several times and he punched me in the face. But I was on my back, so it was at the end of his reach. It didn't really hurt, but it lifted the blindfold just enough that I could see. And I'm looking up at my own feet. And then he went crazy. He grabbed one of the broom handle poles, and I saw him take it and swing it violently. And he took off not just the sock, but my toenail, and I saw the shower of blood gone from my left foot. So at this point, the woman leans into me and says, "Did it hurt?" And the other thing I'm thinking, and the guys in here are going to understand this, I got my legs splayed wide open. I got 6 guys with broom handles beating my legs. You keep thinking, please God, not the nuts. And that's the thing's going through my head. So I explained this to her. At this point, she comes in closer, actually puts her hand on my knee and looks with this, sort of empathetic emotion. She's going to draw it out of me, good journalism, going to draw it out of me. She says, really low voice, "Were you afraid?" "No, I'm RoboCop, lady." The other question I've gotten from the Canadian media, right from it happened right up until now, has always been, will you go back? And I think Moses asked, why did I go back? Why will I go back? When I first arrived home after what I'd been through, the answer was absolutely no way. And if I was going to joke, I'd say, well, my wife will never let me. But as time went on, it's one of those things where you realize that you have a rare knowledge or education from that region of the world, which there isn't a whole lot written, and it's difficult to glean from books as to what's going on now. Very few Westerners and very few reporters have been up in the north, certainly not to the extent that I've been up there. So you think, well, I don't want to lose all of that. I'm not an academic, but I can go down to U.S. universities and give speeches now on the back of what it is I've gleaned. So then I started to say to people, well, I'm not going to rule it out. And that little bit of vagary in my statement led to a Montreal film company, they're also doing a documentary, to jump to the wrong conclusion. They were theoretically going to do this film, and they suggested, would you ever go back? And I said, yeah, in theory, yeah. And then suddenly they got the funding. They were up in my house just about a month ago saying, okay, the airline tickets for July 2nd, you're going back in. And all of a sudden it became real. This isn't hypothetical. And the reason they wanted me to go in seemed to be more based on just simply getting footage of me doing this. There was no reason to go and report. Nothing's changed in the situation. And then I learned that they themselves would not be going with me. But don't worry, it's perfectly safe. It's going to be the final scene in the movie. I also thought my wife would jump to my rescue and say, he's not going, you know, so I don't have to sound like a pussy and say, I'm not going to go. She didn't. She says, listen, he's going to be a big boy. He can make up his own mind, which I thought, oh, thanks a lot. So I spent 2 sleepless nights, and I can say that's the first 2 nights I've had any problem since the entire ordeal. Because up until then, I just blocked it out, compartmentalized it, left that over there, but the idea going back in. I mean, in theory, I'll get back up on a horse, but not maybe the same horse, and not while he's still bucking and jumping in his pen. And so I gave it a lot of thought, then phoned them back and said, no, I can't do it, not right now. So they were saying, okay, we understand, no problem, we'll take you to the border and we'll just film around that. Well, last Thursday, I think it was, June 16th, that all changed. There was a front page photo in the International Herald Tribune, and in that photo was Iraqi captives that were taken in the Americans' latest push in the city of Tal Afar. And lo and behold, one of the guys that beat me is sitting there in the photograph, trussed up. The Americans actually captured him. So they don't know who he is, of course, because what they've done is they've grease-penciled B5 on his forehead. So you know the Americans are just herding these people together and going sorting them out later. So I notified people I knew in the Pentagon and put things through saying, I don't know if you know it, but both myself and the Turkish journalist have identified this individual as the one who assaulted me. And I thought, well, I got a phone call the very next day at my office. It was a Sunday. And this guy comes on a broken phone. This is Major Gary Dangerfield, 3rd Armored Cav in Tal Afar, you know. We want to invite you over for an all-expense-paid trip. So, you know, that's great. So I said, listen, just long enough to identify the guy and get out. And he says, identify what guy? I said, you managed to capture one of my captors. He said, well, we don't know anything about that, but our commanding officer has read my latest book, which is entitled, among the others, shameless plug, Encounters with the Iraqi Turkmen. He'd read the book, and he realized that if they fly me over there, I can help to educate his officers and his soldiers as to who it is that actually is in this city of Tal Afar, because it's a very unique group. And as I said, no Westerners have been in there to talk to them. And I was encouraged by that, because up until now, the Americans just called these guys the bad guys or Saddam lovers or whatever. It's always just everybody else is either good or bad. So this guy, by approaching me in that manner, I thought, okay, they can think about that. They also put into play the fact that they're going to hold the guy in the meantime until I can identify him positively. But I spoke also with my Turkmen contacts, and they were very ecstatic that perhaps I can facilitate a dialogue between the American forces in Tal Afar and these insurgents, or just simply the Turkmen people, to help stop the bloodshed. So for me, when that opportunity arose, it was entirely different than when they said simply, can you go back in for a photo op? I'm being asked now to go in and to make a difference. And I think if I was to say to them, hey, listen, you know what, done my bit, a little bit nervous about that, I wouldn't be me. And I think what we're talking about here at this conference is ideas. Having good ideas and good knowledge is jack squat if you're not prepared to back that up and have the courage to follow it up. And I think of my father gave me the old adage that courage is the one virtue without which all the rest are meaningless. And I think if we can take away from this conference that one thought, then that's something. Okay.